This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Zara Carter lived in the small, nondescript town of Marlowe, Ohio. To the outside world, her life seemed unremarkable, just like everyone else's in this part of the country. The modest brick house she called home sat on the edge of a quiet street, its faded paint and overgrown yard a subtle reflection of the family inside. Zara's father, Earl, was a gruff, chain-smoking mechanic, his hands always covered in oil, his face permanently etched with the exhaustion of someone who had worked too hard for too long. Her mother, Claire, was a homemaker, the kind of woman who held the family together through sheer willpower and traditional values. Her younger brother, Liam, was an unpredictable force of chaos, constantly in trouble, constantly testing the limits of her patience. But Zara was different. Zara always felt like an outsider in her own family. She was the quiet one, the one who stayed in her room for hours, headphones plugged in, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. While Earl and Claire argued about bills or worked through their monotonous routines, Zara disappeared into her online world. YouTube, more than anything else, consumed her thoughts. Zara wasn't interested in school, or in friends, or in the mundane worries that preoccupied other teenagers. All she cared about was her channel. It wasn't a channel that anyone particularly noticed yet, not with only a few hundred subscribers and videos that barely got 1,000 views. But to Zara, it was everything. Her first video was innocent enough a simple makeup tutorial, filmed in the dim light of her bedroom. It wasn't anything special, not compared to the millions of other tutorials that flooded the internet, but it was hers. She had spent hours editing it, tweaking every detail to perfection. Zara was meticulous, obsessed even, with making her content stand out. She learned all the tricks, catchy titles, thumbnail images that popped, and the most important thing of all, how to get views. For weeks, she obsessively checked her analytics, watching the numbers barely move, the subscriber count inching upward in tiny, insignificant increments. It was frustrating. She knew she had more potential than this. She could feel it in her bones. She just needed to figure out what the magic formula was, that one thing that would push her to viral stardom. It wasn't long before Zara grew frustrated with the constant grind of regular content creation. The safe route of makeup tutorials, hauls, and lifestyle vlogs didn't excite her. It was all too predictable, too bland. She watched other YouTubers, especially those in the true crime and horror genres, who seemed to explode in popularity by offering something darker, something more gripping. Zara admired the way these creators captured the attention of millions by feeding off the audience's fear and morbid curiosity. She began to wonder, what if she could do something truly unique, something shocking enough to get the views she craved, something that would make her an undeniable sensation, a household name? Her thoughts slowly shifted from simply creating content to crafting something unforgettable. As Zara entered her teenage years, the pressure to make her mark grew more intense. Her family, especially her mother, had always been supportive, but in the way that most parents were practical, rooted in the real world, and focused on getting through each day without much thought for dreams or aspirations beyond the ordinary. Claire would often tell Zara that YouTube was just a hobby, a passing phase, and that she should focus on her schoolwork and preparing for a future that didn't involve the unpredictable world of online fame. Zara's father, Earl, wasn't much better. He hardly understood what YouTube even was and preferred his daughter to keep her ambitions to herself, not knowing or caring that her growing obsession with the platform had become a source of deep dissatisfaction. Despite their lack of understanding, Zara didn't want to disappoint them, but at the same time, she resented the restrictions they imposed. The world outside her home was a place she couldn't fully touch, a place where fame and success seemed so close, but so far away. And then there was Liam, her 11-year-old brother, who seemed to do everything he could to annoy her. He'd wander into her room, steal things, or make noise while she was recording. Zara often wished he would just disappear, so she could focus entirely on her videos, without the constant interruptions and distractions. Zara had a deep, gnawing hunger for something more than this small town, something more than the life that seemed predetermined for her. She wanted the fame, the recognition, the status that came with being a viral sensation. She had seen how the big creators, the ones with millions of subscribers, were adored, almost idolized by their followers. They didn't have to work in menial jobs or worry about bills. They lived in luxurious homes, traveled the world, and had access to all the things that Zara could only dream of. She wanted that. More than anything, she wanted to feel seen, to feel important, to feel like she mattered in a world that seemed to dismiss her at every turn. The problem was that she didn't know how to make that dream a reality. The more Zara delved into the world of YouTube, the more she became obsessed with the numbers, the views, the engagement. It became a drug. When she posted a video and saw the views creep up, it was like a high, a validation she couldn't get anywhere else. But it wasn't enough. She knew that the world wasn't going to notice her with the kind of content she was putting out. The makeup tutorials and the occasional fashion haul were just white noise in a sea of content. Zara needed something that would make her stand out. She needed a strategy. That's when she started watching the true crime videos. She was fascinated by the way certain creators could tell a story gripping, disturbing, real. They didn't just talk about murders and unsolved mysteries. They immersed their audience in a world of terror, suspense, and morbid curiosity. Zara felt a sick thrill as she watched these videos, captivated by their ability to engage viewers on such a deep, emotional level. It wasn't long before she started to consider how she could make this type of content work for her channel. But Zara wasn't interested in just retelling stories. She wanted to create her own story, something that would make people sit up and take notice, something unforgettable. In her mind, the idea slowly began to take root. What if she could create a real-life horror story? Not a fictional tale, not a reenactment, but something visceral, something that would blur the lines between reality and fiction. Zara's thoughts darkened as she imagined how she could shock her audience, how she could manipulate the world into paying attention to her. She began obsessively researching criminal psychology, the ways in which people could be pushed to commit horrific acts. It wasn't just about getting views anymore. It was about pushing the limits, about transcending the boundaries of what was considered acceptable content. Zara was willing to do anything to be noticed, to become the center of attention. The more she thought about it, the more the idea consumed her. She knew what she had to do. The idea had come to her like a flicker, a brief moment of clarity that soon consumed every corner of her mind. It started when Zara was scrolling through the endless sea of content on YouTube late one night, as she often did, hunting for inspiration. The glow of the screen cast long shadows on her face, the only light in her dim bedroom, as her fingers swiped aimlessly, searching for something to click on. The usual videos, vlogs, beauty tips, and gameplay walkthroughs were familiar, comforting, but it was the darker side of YouTube that held her attention now. The channels dedicated to true crime, to the horrific, the unexplainable, the shocking. Zara had always been drawn to them, not out of morbid curiosity, but because they had something that no other content seemed to offer: raw, unfiltered engagement. When people watched these videos, they didn't just comment, they reacted. They shared their thoughts, their theories, their fears. These creators had power, real power. They could make an audience tremble, could provoke thought, could stir emotions. And Zara wanted that power. More than anything, she wanted it. She'd spend hours binge-watching videos about unsolved murders, disappearances, and conspiracy theories, all carefully crafted to draw the viewer in. She was particularly fascinated by the true crime channels that focused on infamous cases, the ones that never seemed to have an ending. These channels told stories with such intensity, with a sense of urgency, as though the world might forget the victims if they didn't keep reminding people. They thrived on suspense, on the unresolved. They painted a picture of tragedy, sometimes so compelling that Zara could feel the weight of it long after she closed her laptop. She watched as these videos gained millions of views, thousands of comments, likes pouring in from all corners of the world. There was something intoxicating about it. The intrigue. The intrigue. The way people felt connected to the story, even though it was often terrifying and deeply unsettling. One night, while watching yet another video about a high-profile murder case, something inside her clicked. Zara's eyes widened as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She didn't have to rely on other people's stories. She didn't have to retell the same old cases that everyone had heard 1,000 times. What if she could create her own story? A real story, not just a reenactment or an analysis of some cold case. A story so horrific that it would shock the world. She could make herself the central figure in a narrative, a figure so deeply embedded in the minds of her audience that they would never forget her name. For a moment, Zara's pulse quickened as she let the idea settle in her mind. She imagined the headlines, the media frenzy, the online reaction, the subscribers pouring in from every corner of the globe, eager to know more. Zara's face would be plastered everywhere on the trending page, in the news, in the most talked about corners of the internet. She could be the next big thing. All it would take was one perfect act, one horrific, unforgettable act. She felt her stomach turn at the thought, but it wasn't the kind of discomfort that made her pull back. No, this was a different kind of feeling, the kind of feeling that drove her forward, that whispered in her ear to push harder, to reach further. It was the same kind of thrill she felt when she edited her videos, the adrenaline rush of watching the numbers climb, of seeing the reactions flood in. This would be no different. It would be a challenge, but it would be hers to control. Zara knew exactly how she could execute this. She had spent months watching true crime documentaries, reading articles about notorious crimes, studying the psychology behind the perpetrators, and understanding what it took to make people believe. She understood how important it was to make the story seem authentic, to make the public feel like they were watching something real unfold before their eyes. The trick, she realized, was to create the perfect blend of reality and fiction, something so convincing that people wouldn't know where one ended and the other began. Zara's mind raced with possibilities. She knew her family well. She knew their routines, their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. The perfect setup was already in place. The first step was clear. The crime had to feel random, unexpected. It couldn't be planned in a way that would give the authorities any real leads, but it had to have just enough structure to make it seem deliberate, chilling, and calculated. It had to be violent enough to make people recoil, but not so violent that it would overshadow the story itself. The victims would have to be close to her, people who her audience would connect with, who would make the story more tragic. It would need to hit hard, but it had to hit in the right way emotionally and psychologically. Zara thought of her family, the people who had always been just out of reach when it came to understanding her. They had always been obstacles, something she had to work around, to escape from. They would be the perfect players in this dark drama she was about to create. Her father, Earl, was a man who would never notice if she stayed in her room for days on end. Her mother, Claire, was too busy with her routines to pay close attention to what Zara was really doing. And Liam, her annoying, troublesome younger brother, was always a loose cannon, someone who wouldn't be missed if he wasn't around for a while. Zara felt a sick thrill as she considered it all. Her family, so central to her life, could be the perfect backdrop to her masterpiece. She would make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. The setup would be key. She would lock the doors, leave just enough evidence to make it seem like it was random, a tragic accident. And then, she would capture it all on film, from start to finish, just as she had watched other YouTubers do. The footage would be chilling, captivating. She would film herself preparing, setting up the scene, everything. The violence would be there, but not in a way that felt gratuitous. It would be the kind of violence that left people shaken, left them wondering how they could have missed the signs. And then, the real trick would be the aftermath, the way she presented herself to the world after the fact. Zara knew that the story had to unfold just right. It couldn't be rushed. She would post the video, edit it with the right amount of suspense, the right amount of tragedy, and she would make sure the title was perfect. It had to be simple, shocking, and irresistible. The comments would flood in, the theories would explode, and Zara would watch as her subscriber count skyrocketed. She could see it in her mind, her name trending worldwide, her face flashing across the screen of every social media platform, her story whispered in every corner of the internet. The world would watch. The world would remember, and Zara would finally be the star she had always wanted to be. All she had to do was push the button, make the final decision to turn her darkest thoughts into a reality. She didn't feel fear, not the kind that would make her hesitate. She felt something else entirely: exhilaration, a rush of power. It was the kind of rush she had been chasing for so long, and now she had the chance to seize it. The plan was simple, and for the first time in a long while, Zara felt in control. As Zara's obsession with her channel deepened, so did the distance between her and her family. What had once been a quiet passion hidden behind the closed door of her bedroom, where she tinkered with editing software and scrolled through endless videos, slowly morphed into something darker, something that began to bleed into every aspect of her life. The walls of her room became a fortress, a place where Zara retreated not just to escape her family, but to prepare. It was here, alone, that she began to think in isolation, to plan without interruption. But the more she withdrew, the more the tension grew inside the house. No one could put their finger on it at first. The change was subtle, creeping into Zara's behavior like a shadow that darkened every corner of her life. Her mother, Claire, noticed it first. She would catch glimpses of Zara through the doorway, hunched over her laptop, her face illuminated by the screen in the dim light of the room. Claire didn't know much about YouTube, but she could tell that her daughter was spending more time in there than ever before. Zara had always been a quiet girl, reserved even, but now there was something else, something that set her apart from the girl she had once known. Zara had always been somewhat distant, but it was different now. There was a coldness to her that had not been there before. Claire would call to her from the kitchen, asking her if she wanted dinner, if she needed anything, but Zara's responses were clipped, distracted. Sometimes, Claire would go into her room to find Zara sitting at her desk, her eyes fixed on the screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her earbuds firmly in place, blocking out everything around her. Claire would stand in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to say, but in the end, she would leave, telling herself that it was just a phase. It was just the way teenagers were, right? But the longer Zara stayed in her room, the more Claire began to wonder if there was more to it. Earl, her father, was no better at reading the signs. He worked long hours at the garage, coming home late, tired, his hands and clothes covered in grease and the scent of oil. He had never been one to understand Zara's passion for video creation. In fact, he often dismissed it as a waste of time. "Get a real job," he'd say when she mentioned her YouTube aspirations. "This stuff doesn't pay the bills." His world was one of concrete and metal, of engines and mechanical tools. He couldn't fathom the idea that Zara wanted to be something else, something bigger, and the more she spent in front of that screen, the more his frustration grew. He'd snap at her, asking why she couldn't be more like her friends, why she couldn't go out and do something normal. But Zara barely listened anymore. She'd offer a half-hearted answer and then disappear into her room again, where the real world felt so much smaller, more manageable. Liam, her younger brother, was a different case entirely. Zara didn't need to worry about him. He was loud, he was annoying, and he had a knack for showing up at the most inconvenient times. He'd barge into her room without knocking, mess with her things, and constantly invade her space. Zara hated it, hated how he seemed to exist just to disrupt her. But there was something more to her irritation now. Something inside her had shifted. Where once she might have simply rolled her eyes and let him be, now she found herself boiling with frustration. She wanted him out. She wanted him gone. But instead of telling him to leave, Zara started to avoid him, retreating further into her own world. Every time Liam poked his head into her room, every time he made noise while she was recording, a spark of rage would flare inside her. and she'd feel her grip on herself slip just a little bit more. As the weeks passed, Zara's behavior grew more erratic. She began to spend entire days locked in her room, her focus narrowing to a single point: the creation of her next video, the execution of her plan. Her family's concerns became louder, more insistent. Claire asked her repeatedly what was wrong, why she had become so distant, but Zara's answers grew shorter, more dismissive. The truth was, Zara couldn't explain what was happening inside her. The more she withdrew from her family, the more the world of YouTube consumed her. It wasn't just about the videos anymore. It was about something darker, something that felt like it had a life of its own, something that twisted inside her chest every time she thought about her next move. She couldn't talk about it. No one would understand. And besides, the more isolated she became, the more the idea began to feel right. She was becoming someone else, someone stronger, someone who no longer needed her family to hold her back. Her interactions with her parents became terse. Claire would knock on her door in the morning, asking if Zara was ready to go to school, but Zara would simply mumble that she wasn't feeling well or that she would walk there later. It wasn't that she didn't want to see her classmates. She just couldn't bring herself to care anymore. What did it matter? The world she cared about was the one inside the screen, the one that was filled with strangers who didn't ask questions, who didn't judge her. Zara's thoughts became more internal, more focused on the plan she was executing in the background, the plan that would free her from all the constraints of the life she had known. There were moments, of course, when Zara felt a flicker of guilt, when the weight of what she was considering would press down on her, if only for a brief moment. She thought about her mother's concerned face, her father's gruff indifference, Liam's irritating laugh. But then the guilt would fade, swallowed by the increasing intensity of her desire for recognition, for validation. The silence in her room became her sanctuary, and the isolation, once uncomfortable, became an armor. She didn't need anyone. She didn't want anyone. Her thoughts, her plans, her obsession, these were the things that mattered now. Zara's isolation reached a peak when she began cutting off her connections to the outside world. She unfriended people on social media, people she had once considered her friends. She didn't need them. They didn't understand. There was no one who could share in her vision. Her former schoolmates, the ones who had once asked her to hang out or grabbed lunch with her between classes, became distant memories, distant names that meant nothing. Zara stopped answering texts, ignored calls, and eventually, when the occasional message from a friend popped up, she would delete it without a second thought. She wasn't interested in their lives, in their petty dramas, their teenage distractions. They were insignificant to her now. What mattered was the content. What mattered was the plan. Even her appearance began to change. The neat clothes she used to wear, the ones her mother picked out for her, were replaced by loose, oversized shirts and sweatpants, clothes that matched the person Zara was becoming. She didn't care about the way she looked anymore. There was no point in it. It wasn't like anyone was paying attention to her in the real world. The only place she felt seen was in the cold, glowing light of her computer screen. As the hours stretched into days, her sense of time started to warp. She no longer cared about the mundane markers of a day, the ringing of an alarm clock, the hum of the television in the living room, the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. It was as if she existed in her own dimension, one that only the digital world could fully comprehend. And in that world, Zara was the star. She just needed to take the next step to make that reality bleed into the physical one. Her isolation was complete. And in that stillness, in the silence that enveloped her, the dark idea that had taken root began to grow louder, clearer, more pressing. Zara was no longer just a girl with a channel. She was something more, something dangerous, and no one, least of all her family, could see it coming. The night of the crime arrived like any other, except Zara knew it wouldn't end the same. The evening was suffused with a muted, cold light as dusk settled over Marlowe, Ohio. The air outside felt sharp, like it always did just before the first frost. But inside the Carter household, everything seemed eerily still. It was a quiet night, too quiet. Zara's family had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss. Earl was in the garage, as usual, tinkering with his tools, lost in the familiar motions of his work. Claire was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, humming softly to herself, the kind of comforting hum that Zara had grown to resent. Liam, her little brother, was no doubt up in his room, playing video games or causing some minor chaos. No one noticed Zara. No one ever did anymore, at least not in the way she wanted them to. Her room, as it always was dark, except for the flicker of her computer screen. Zara sat at her desk, her hands steady as she clicked through her last set of preparations. The video she had been editing all week was ready, but tonight wasn't about the video. Not yet. Tonight, she was going to execute the plan she had carefully crafted. Her fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment, as though she were in prayer, but there was no turning back now. The hunger for attention, for recognition, for something more than this small town, had grown too great. The numbness she felt when she thought about her family, how they had failed to see her, how they had failed to see her as anything more than their daughter or their sister, had hardened into something much darker. Zara felt nothing but a hollow certainty. This would be her moment. She had prepared for everything. The house was quiet, the perfect setting. Earl had a late-night shift tomorrow, so he wouldn't be home for hours. Claire would likely stay up, folding laundry, or watching something mindless on television. Liam would be in his room, as always, isolated from anything that was truly happening. Zara had been waiting for this moment for weeks, watching the clock tick closer, counting down the hours until it was time. She knew her family's schedule by heart, knew the rhythm of their lives, like she knew her own heartbeat. Everything was set, and now all she had to do was move forward. Her first step was to make sure the house was completely isolated. She grabbed the heavy metal bolt from her drawer and locked the front door, securing it in place. It was a simple act, but it served to mark the beginning of something irreversible. Zara turned off the lights in her room, plunging the house into near darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of her laptop screen. She checked the camera that was mounted in the corner of her room. The recording would be important. The footage had to capture everything. It was the anchor, the lifeline, to the reality of what was about to happen. The plan had been in motion for days, and the small details had been sorted. Zara had been acting as normal as she could, engaging with her family just enough to avoid suspicion. Her interactions were always brief because she couldn't risk getting too close. The distance she had maintained from them was essential. No one would ever suspect a thing, not with the way she had been playing the part of the distant, introverted teenager. Everything about her now was a facade, carefully constructed to keep the truth from their eyes. Zara's heart was steady as she moved silently through the house, feeling each floorboard beneath her feet, careful not to make a sound. She was a ghost in her own home. It was then that she heard the sound of her mother's voice, faint but clear, drifting from the kitchen. Zara froze for a moment, her hand still on the doorknob of her bedroom, but the impulse passed quickly. Claire would stay in the kitchen for a while, she always did. Zara slipped out of her room, making her way down the hall, past the staircase that led to Liam's room. She could hear him through the thin walls, the faint buzzing of his game console, the occasional exclamation as he played. He was so easy to ignore, to leave behind in this moment. Zara moved through the house with the quiet precision of a predator. As she entered the kitchen, she saw her mother standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot. The sound of the spoon scraping against the metal echoed in the otherwise silent house. Claire didn't turn when Zara walked in. She rarely did. Zara stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her mother, noting the soft curve of her face as she hummed to herself, lost in the act of making dinner. She used to wonder what her mother was thinking in moments like this. But tonight, all Zara could think about was how easy it would be to slip away. Her mother was lost in her own thoughts, her back turned, unaware of the way the night was slipping out of her hands. The cold knife drawer caught Zara's eye, and her pulse quickened. But there was no turning back now. She moved quietly, deliberately, and grabbed the sharpest blade she could find. Her fingers closed around the cool handle, and for a moment, She felt a rush of adrenaline surge through her. It wasn't fear, not really. It was more like the rush before a race, before something that she knew would change everything. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, it felt almost anticlimactic. Zara took a deep breath, a final exhale, and made her way back toward the hallway, toward the stairs. There was no hesitation now. She climbed the stairs slowly, methodically. Her brother's room was the first door on the right, and she could hear him still playing his game, laughing under his breath. She imagined for a moment what it might feel like to just open the door and tell him to shut up, to tell him to stop being so damn loud. But instead, Zara kept moving. Her mother had been distracted for too long. She moved toward Earl's room, the door closed but not locked. The room smelled of tobacco and sweat, the familiar scent of a man who had spent too many hours working in the grime of the garage. Zara hesitated for a fraction of a second before pushing the door open, her breath catching in her throat. She felt calm again, serene even, like a switch had been flipped in her mind. This wasn't about fear. It was about control. It was about doing something no one would ever expect. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her father's still form lying in bed. He had been working hard all week, as he always did. She watched the rise and fall of his chest for a moment, the rhythmic sound of his breath filling the space between them. Her thoughts were clouded now, the plan unfolding in real time, the details sliding into place with alarming precision. She didn't need to think anymore. The blade was in her hand, and it was the only thing that mattered. It all happened so quickly, faster than she had anticipated. Her father didn't wake up as she stepped closer, her footsteps so light that even his trained ears couldn't hear her approach. Zara had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but reality was sharper. The steel of the knife glinted in the dim light as it descended with practiced precision. It was over almost before it had begun. The finality of it settled over her like a wave, and for the first time, Zara felt something close to relief. The sounds of struggle, the muffled noise of a body shifting in its final moments, echoed in the house, but Zara barely registered it. She was already moving again, heading down the stairs, the next part of the plan already in motion. The quiet of the night was now broken, forever. Zara's pulse thrummed in her ears, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had done it. Now, all she had to do was finish the job. By the time she returned to the living room, her world had shifted. Everything was different. Everything felt different. The house seemed smaller now, suffocating. The plan had become real, and Zara, for the first time, felt a sense of clarity and overwhelming certainty that this was what she had been working for. It had all led to this moment. The silence after the chaos was suffocating, a dense, oppressive stillness that hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Zara stood in the center of the living room, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen the only sound, as her mind struggled to process what she had just done. The weight of her actions did not settle in immediately, as she had expected. Instead, she felt light, almost euphoric. It was the kind of feeling you get when you've been holding your breath for far too long and finally release it in a rush. There was no fear, no regret, just a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the world had shifted irrevocably because of her. The night outside was still as dark as it had been before, but inside the house, everything had changed. Zara's footsteps were the only sounds echoing through the empty halls, her heart thumping in her chest as she moved in a daze, her mind unable to fully comprehend the enormity of what had just occurred. The plan had gone off without a hitch, each moment falling into place like a carefully executed puzzle. Her father, Earl, was no longer in his bed, his body lifeless, just as she had imagined it would be. Claire and Liam were still in their rooms, their fates now sealed, their lives reduced to mere props in a story Zara had authored. She moved slowly, cautiously, back to her room. Her heart was still racing, the adrenaline keeping her alert. The camera in the corner of the room was still recording, capturing every subtle shift in her expression. She had intended to take the footage in stride, to edit it into something sensational, to make the world believe in the authenticity of her creation. But as she sat in front of the screen, watching herself on the monitor, the rush of the moment began to wane, and the weight of her actions began to sink in. At first, it was a strange, detached feeling, as though she were watching someone else. The girl on the screen, her eyes wide with the intensity of her plan, seemed foreign to her now. Zara had expected to feel some regret, maybe, or even fear, but there was nothing. Instead, she felt a sick sense of calm, the kind that only came after crossing a line you could never uncross. She had killed her family, killed them for views, for attention, for the ultimate content that would skyrocket her channel to unimaginable heights. The sheer brutality of it should have made her sick, but it didn't. It only made her feel powerful, more powerful than she had ever felt before. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the urge to start editing the footage almost overwhelming. She had to do it now. She had to make the world see this. She couldn't wait. But as her eyes traced the raw images of the murder on her screen, something began to creep into her mind. It wasn't guilt, not at first. It wasn't even fear. It was something far more insidious, something that twisted and turned inside her chest until it squeezed her heart in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. Zara leaned back in her chair, staring at the footage as it played on loop. She had done what she had set out to do, had taken control of the narrative. She had staged the perfect crime. Yet, as she watched herself in the video, a gnawing thought began to take shape, one that she couldn't push away. She had done everything she could to make the story seem real. But now that it was real, now that the consequences were undeniable, the truth began to gnaw at her like a silent predator. What if it hadn't been worth it? What if everything she had done, every decision she had made, was just a manifestation of her own fear and loneliness, her desperate need for recognition? What if the thing that had driven her to kill her family wasn't some grand ambition for fame, but something much darker, much more selfish? The more Zara stared at the screen, the more the weight of it all pressed down on her. The clarity she had once felt began to slip away, replaced by a cold realization. She wasn't in control. Not really. She had thought that by taking a life, she would take control of her destiny, of her future. But now she understood something more terrifying. She had only become a pawn in the very story she had tried to control. She had thought she was the creator, the author, the mastermind. But now, she could see it clearly. The story was writing her, not the other way around. As Zara sat there, the air in the room thick with her realization, the emptiness she had tried to fill with views and fame felt unbearable. She had sacrificed everything: her family, her humanity, her future for the illusion of something that was never truly hers to begin with. The camera, still recording, seemed to mock her, its red light blinking steadily, as though it was reminding her that the world would soon see everything she had done. But that wasn't enough. The world could watch all it wanted. What was the point if it wasn't real? If it didn't make her feel whole? For the first time since that fateful night, Zara's fingers trembled as they hovered over the keyboard. She had crafted the perfect story, but in doing so, she had lost the one thing she had been seeking all along: meaning. The thought of editing the footage, of making it go viral, seemed hollow now. It was as if the video itself had become a symbol of her own emptiness. It wasn't enough to just have views. It wasn't enough to just have the world watch her pain, her violence. Zara needed something more, something deeper, something that could fill the void inside her. Her mind raced through the events of the night, through the coldness she had felt as she carried out the murders. The knife in her hand had felt so familiar, so natural, as though it was an extension of herself. She had done what she had to do, she reminded herself. It wasn't about the blood, the chaos. It was about power. But now, as she sat in her room, watching the images of her family's destruction unfold on the screen, she realized that power had never been the goal. It had always been about control. And the one thing she had failed to realize was that control wasn't something you could take. It was something you had to earn. The clock on her desk ticked louder. each passing second marking the growing distance between the girl she had been and the monster she had become. Zara's stomach twisted as she sat in the silence, the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest. She had thought that once she crossed that line, everything would fall into place. But now, all she could feel was the emptiness of the life she had destroyed. The video would go live soon. She would edit it, upload it, and let the world see the horror she had created. But in that moment, Zara realized that there was nothing anyone could say, no amount of views or fame, that would fill the hollow space inside her. She had killed for nothing. And the worst part was, she had known all along that it was never about the views. It was about something much darker. It was about her own desperate need for recognition, for a world that would finally see her, for someone to finally acknowledge the pain she had been hiding for so long. The camera continued to record, capturing every flicker of uncertainty that crossed Zara's face. The final act had been completed, but the story was far from over. As the days drifted on, the initial surge of adrenaline that Zara had felt after the murders began to wear off, but something far darker had taken its place. What she had once viewed as a step toward freedom, a final act of rebellion against the ordinary constraints of her life, now felt like a slow, suffocating descent. The fame she had anticipated, the rush of thousands of viewers pouring in to watch the footage of her crime, never came. Instead, there was silence. The views on her video plateaued, and the comments once so hopeful and energetic began to slip into the darker corners of the internet. They weren't the adoration she had envisioned. They were disgust, horror, pity. She had sought the spotlight, but it had burned her. Zara's mind, which had once been a sharp, calculated machine, now seemed to unravel in strange ways. Every noise in the house felt like a threat. Every shadow on her bedroom wall seemed to stretch, like it was watching her. She could no longer escape the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, made her jump in terror. The silence, once comforting, was now oppressive, like a living thing that pressed in on her from every side. It was as though she had opened a door into a room she couldn't escape, a room that was constantly shifting, reconfiguring itself to trap her further inside. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had truly felt like herself. The girl who had once dreamed of fame, of a world that would see her, now seemed distant, like a fading echo in the back of her mind. She hadn't just killed her family. She had killed something in herself, something vital, and she couldn't remember how to bring it back. Every time she tried to relive the satisfaction of that first night, the feeling of power and control, it slipped away, replaced by a creeping, insidious terror. What had once felt like liberation now felt like chains. The footage she had once been eager to edit and share had begun to haunt her. The video itself, so meticulously planned and executed, became an anchor that dragged her deeper into her own twisted reality. She watched it over and over, not with pride, but with a growing sense of dread. The faces of her family, their final expressions, the rawness of the act itself, it was too much to bear. Every frame burned itself into her mind, an endless loop of her own creation. What had started as an attempt to seize control, to demand attention, now felt like an inescapable prison. Zara couldn't stop watching. It was as though the video had taken on a life of its own, driving her deeper into the madness that was now slowly consuming her. Her reflection in the mirror, once a familiar sight, now looked foreign. Her eyes were dull, her face gaunt, as though the very act of killing had drained the life from her. She was no longer the girl who had longed for recognition. Now, all she felt was the relentless pull of the void, the need to keep going, to keep recording, to keep running from the horror of what she had become. She didn't understand it. She didn't understand why she couldn't stop, why the urge to spiral deeper into the darkness seemed to pull her further and further away from everything she had known. And as the silence of the house grew louder, as the hours bled into days and then weeks, Zara's descent into madness began in earnest. Her once perfectly curated online presence began to falter as well. The posts she had made were no longer received with excitement. Instead, they were filled with anger, confusion, and fear. Zara had expected the attention she craved, but she hadn't expected this, the growing sense that she had opened a door she couldn't shut. It was as if the world was closing in around her, and the more she retreated into herself, the more it seemed to press against her, suffocating her from all sides. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back.